All right. What up, everybody? How's it going, peeps? All right, I don't know. I'm just trying. I'm motivated. I'm energized. We're going to talk about something super exciting and super not depressing today, and that is the Great Depression. Get it? Because I'm saying it's not depressive, but it's the Great Depression. All right. Well, I mean, none of you would have laughed even if it was in person. All right. I hope you're having a good day. Please treat the substitute teacher very nicely. If it's the guy I think it is, then be nice to him, and definitely don't ask him for starbursts. All right. So let's go ahead and get started today. Bell work on the screen. Obviously, you're going to do that on your bell work sheet. Identify continuities and changes in holdings in East Asia and the Middle East. Basically, kind of one way to answer this is that places like China are still going to have economic influence by European powers, by the Japanese. That continues even after World War One. We are going to see that there still is colonies in Africa. We see that there are colonies in the form of protectorates, I should say, in East Asia. I should say in the Middle East with the mandate system. Kind of that's the new thing, though, is that the new system is the mandate system. There's no longer the Ottoman Empire, too. That's changing. Awesome. Well, if you have any questions about this, make sure you talk to me, or look, talk to your neighbor, something like that. All right. So, regardless of where I'm going to go with all of this strange commentary, today you're going to be taking a look at the interwar period. Basically, you're going to look at the time frame between World War One and World War Two. And specifically, you're going to look at one of the biggest economic crises in world history, and that is the Great Depression. The Great Depression, so called because it's not just going to impact the United States, but it's going to impact every country around the world. Kind of that's the downside of a global economy in a way, is that economic decline in one place hits everywhere. So basically, what you're going to answer is how do governments respond to economic crisis? And in this case, you're going to pay attention to how governments respond to the Great Depression. Last lesson objective with Stalin and the Russian Revolution, it's how did the Soviet Union transform its economy? But today we're going to look outside of the Soviet Union and we're going to take a look at how the world responds to the Great Depression. But before we do that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about social developments after World War I, because there are a few examples of that. But before we do that, a little bit about the economy. Well, the economy of the post-war era is going to be one in which we see a transition away from total war, from total government presence in the economy, towards laissez-faire, a return, you could say, to laissez-faire capitalism. And generally, the time period after World War One is going to see an economic boom in industrial production, especially in the United States. The United States was not really impacted by World War One. There was no trenches, no bombing of cities. So World War One is going to kind of benefit the United States, especially. The United States is emerging as a major industrial power, and it's going to kind of become one of the top ones. That's really after World War Two, though. But generally, why do we see an increased economic boom? Well, we do see that kind of there is a consumer culture that emerges, one in which there is interest in buying stuff, anything. And kind of one of the things about the First World War is that during the war itself, there was a lot more technological advances in manufacturing things and different consumer technologies, namely things like the automobile, like cars. So we do kind of see that World War One saw improvements in faster methods of production, namely the assembly line. That's going to become more widespread after World War One, although its origins happened during the Second Industrial Revolution. And because we do have this faster means of producing consumer goods, this is going to increase the availability of consumer goods. One of the biggest and most iconic of the 1920s is the automobile. Companies that you might recognize, like Ford, for example, are going to produce a lot of manufactured goods, namely cars. So there is going to be increased supply of manufactured goods thanks to improvements in manufacturing that happened during World War I. That's generally true about wars in the 20th century, is that wars tend to bring out improvements in technology and science. But we also see that there is going to be increased trade around the world thanks to improvements in transportation technology. We are going to see that World War I saw the development of airplanes as a military technology, but improvements to that are going to actually be applied to civilian life, to peacetime as well. Airplanes are going to gradually become one way in which we have a globalized economy. Airplanes are not really going to have wide-scale transportation of things, but improvements in communication at the very least is going to allow for faster technology, faster communication of mail, for example. But ships, improvements to shipping technology. At first, during the war, it was for military reasons, but now that can be applied to peacetime. Ships can go faster, and thus ships can transport things quicker. So kind of the rapid involvement of technology in terms of airplanes and communication, in terms of ships, this is going to create a globalized economy. So after World War I, we do kind of see that there will be a demand by civilians for manufactured goods. There is relatively high employment even after World War I in some cases, but we see that there is improved demand as well. And generally, this leads to increased economic prosperity, at least for some. And really, we kind of call the 1920s, the post-World War I period, the so-called Roaring Twenties. And they're roaring for a few reasons, mostly because we see a rapid explosion in technology and economic prosperity. And generally, kind of the 1920s is going to be defined in Western countries as an era of consumerism. There is high employment, there is a lot of prosperity and money, especially flowing upwards. We see the expansion of the middle class. And this is going to lead to an environment in which people have money to purchase things. And guess what? They're going to buy the latest consumer technologies, like the automobile, like toasters, like the radio. So we do see a rapid, not so much toasters, but radio and cars especially. But we also see that after World War II, there's going to be a bit of deregulation. Remember, during World War I, we had the total war. We had the complete government coordination of the economy and society to conduct World War I. But after the war is over, suddenly government is going to take a step back. And we are going to see a return, briefly, of laissez-faire economics. So we do see a deregulation of the economy. We do see that private corporations are coming back, basically. And there is going to be a lot of deregulation in the economy, especially in the banking system. And banks are going to kind of engage in very shady deals across the Western world, but especially in the United States. And in this case, we'd see shady business dealings in the form of the stock market. The stock market is essentially, as you all know, kind of a place where people buy shares of publicly traded companies. And oftentimes banks are putting depositors' money into investing into the stock market. This is illegal, by the way, today. And the reason why it's illegal is because this is going to help cause the Great Depression. The unregulated nature of the banking and stock market is going to lead to the Great Depression. Banks are going to put money, depositors' money. People put money in banks for some reason, and then banks use those deposits to invest in the stock market. And the stock market is great for making money when it's going up. Because the stock market, if anything, is going to change rapidly. And as we will see later, when it declines, banks suddenly lose a lot of money. They lose depositors' money. They're unable to give loans to businesses. They're going to call back their loans with higher interest rates. And that's going to cause the Great Depression, as we will see. But there are a lot of problems in the 1920s, despite the fact that generally there is increased economic prosperity. Because while there is a lot more wealth being generated during the 1920s, it's only for a little bit of people. It's kind of going to be a time period in which very wealthy people become even more wealthy. There is more people generally in the middle class. However, as we're going to see in a second, it's a largely unstable economy. So a lot more wealth, but for only a small minority of the population. But we also see that kind of there is an unstable banking system, meaning banks are not insured if they suddenly run out of money. Just as a spoiler alert, today, banks are insured for their money. So we do kind of see that banks are not going to have insurances, that they have enough money to give to their depositors. But also we do see that in specific parts around the world, we do have some economic drawbacks of the post-war period. And in particular, in Germany, we're going to have a phenomenon known as hyperinflation. And why do we see hyperinflation? But before we do that, what is it? Well, basically, inflation means prices are going up. Hyperinflation, prices are going even higher than normal. And in particular, we see inflation, well, really across much of Europe. But Germany is probably the worst impacted from this inflation. And why is that? Well, Germany, remember, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, had to pay reparations. They had to pay reparations to all the countries they wronged in World War I, which was all of the Allies, all of the victorious people. So Germany, in order to pay these reparations, they're going to print more money. And that's a bad way to pay for things, because printing money suddenly means money is less valuable. You need to pay more money because prices are going up. So prices are going up. That's kind of a big result of inflation. And in Germany, it's going through the roof. Literally, people need to have wheelbarrows of German money to pay back any loans they might have, but even to pay things for things like groceries. Literally, people are going to grocery stores with wheelbarrows because bread prices, food prices are through the roof. Money is virtually worthless. You need so much of it to pay for things. So hyperinflation is a big concern, especially in Germany after World War I. However, we do see that there are attempts to solve this. There are some solutions, actually. The United States, actually, which was not very much in favor of reparations to begin with. Remember, Wilson didn't like the idea of a harsh Treaty of Versailles. He went along with it, but he didn't like it. We do see that there is an attempt by the United States to actually help out Germany, and that is something called the Dawes Plan. Basically, the United States is going to loan Germany money so that it can pay back its reparations. However, the kind of downside of this is that the German economy, if it wants to stay afloat, is kind of dependent on if American banks are still open. It would be a great shame if those American banks suddenly collapsed, if they suddenly lost all of their money in the stock market, because they're investing in the stock market. All right, any questions? Oh, guess what? You can't ask me right now. Drop a comment down below if you're frustrated I'm not there to answer your great questions. All right, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind for a second. But let's take a look at kind of changes in class dynamics. What are some social changes as a result of of the Roaring Twenties? Well, generally after World War I, we are going to see a lot more social mobility. And there's a few reasons for this. For one thing, people have jobs. They have jobs in factories because factories are meeting the demand of the market. So factories are producing more, they need more workers, basically. So there is a lot more employment in industrial countries thanks to high demand. Because there's high employment, that means people have money. And when people have money, there tends to be more social advancements. And generally, we do see that after World War I, there will be an expansion of the middle class, lifestyle. On the very top, we have extremely wealthy people like billionaires and millionaires like John D. Rockefeller in the United States. But we also have kind of people that are more modest in terms of their economic income, I should say. And this middle class is going to expand thanks to high employment after World War I. But generally, we do kind of see that this middle class is going to kind of not make very good economic decisions. For one thing, we are going to see that there is a lot of speculation. And speculation essentially means investment in the stock market. Middle class people are saying to themselves, whoa, I could get extremely rich if I put a lot of my savings into the stock market, which will never collapse. So there kind of is this carefree free mentality. People suffered through a horrible war. They just want to make money. They think that life is meaningless, that in order to find meaning, I should just live like there's no tomorrow. I should get rich quick. And a way to do that is investing in the stock market. So generally after World War I, there will be increased speculation, middle-class participation in the stock market. But we also see middle-class people making not so good decisions in the form of buying on credit. Basically, they're going to buy stuff they don't have money for. That's what buying on credit is. They're going to take out loans from banks, which will never collapse. They're going to pay in installment plans that have interest rates. It would be a shame if they couldn't pay back these loans or these installment plans. So we do kind of see that there is an unstable market. People are buying things without the money to back it up. They're buying based on loans. They're buying using early forms of credits. Kind of think of credit cards today, how basically you charge a credit card company for something and you have to pay that back in interest. That's what was going on in the 1920s. However, in terms of other areas of class, in terms of other areas of society, we do see changes in gender dynamics. One more thing, actually, before we look at gender, before we look at women, is that we do see kind of less presence of the aristocracy in Europe, of the nobility. The nobility generally declines after World War I for a few reasons. Nobody likes them because they're viewed as unpopular for starting World War I. We see the rise of more republics in Europe after World War I, the collapse of the German Empire, collapse of Austria-Hungary. These new governments tend to be republics. Nobody likes the aristocracy. They're kind of drowned out in political voice. They're voted out of office. And mostly it will be really wealthy people that aren't nobles. Basically, that's what's happening. Also, a lot of them are dead too because they tended to be military leaders in World War I. And World War I saw a lot of people dying. Also, in Russia, there's no nobility because they're all dead too. They were executed. However, getting back to women real quick, and it is International Women's Month, so good job, women. Good job. All right, so generally, let's talk about women. Well, actually, women are going to experience kind of a bit of a lot of unprecedented freedom because of World War I. Remember, during World War I, a lot of women worked in factories. And a lot of women are going to for the first time for many people after the Second Industrial Revolution, women are working in factory areas. And this gives women a sense of economic independence, even though there will be social pressure to have women leave factories. Generally, World War I really starts a trend that generally more and more women are feeling economic independent. So women are going to experience a lot more economic independence thanks to their involvement in employment opportunities in World War I. So women are going to kind of also, at least very wealthy women, they're also going to kind of experience a lot more social changes. There is going to be a largely more carefree environment when it comes to gender roles. There is going to be a little bit more acceptance of things like LGBT, for example. We do see that some middle class women are also going to dress differently as well. They're tired of the sick and depressing nature of World War I. They're going to dress like flappers. And you might have seen the iconic image of the flappers. Basically, these are women that are not wearing that many clothes, to be quite frankly. They're wearing short skirts with a lot of leg being exposed. So there generally tends to be kind of more social freedom for women after World War I, at least in Western countries. Women are dressing not provocatively, because that's not a good thing to say, but they're dressing less modestly, I guess. So dressing kind of more skin exposed generally. And women are also gaining a lot of economic and political freedoms in Western countries. In places like the United States, kind of there will be movements to demand full female suffrage. And these are actually going to be successful after World War I. Governments are going to say, women, you did us a solid helping us out by being in the factories during World War I. Guess what? We're going to give you the right to vote. So in places like the United States, women are going to gain the right to vote as well. The suffrage movement is going to be successful. Women have the right to vote in many Western countries. Awesome. Women feel a lot more open in terms of social kind of presence, dressing more, less modestly, I should say. But also there is going to be more of a freedom of a culture that accepts things like birth control, for example. That's going to become kind of big after World War I. Margaret Sanger is an example of that. She's going to be the person who founds what will become Planned Parenthood in the United States. So that's just one example right there. So women generally are going to have more economic and social independence after World War I. World War I starts a trend of more freedom for women in the economy and society. Divorce becomes kind of legal in a lot of places as well. Awesome. Let's look at technology. Well, generally, we do see that World War I caused a lot of advances in science, both in terms of producing things, of manufacturing, and generally, wars tend to lead to improvements in technology that will be carried on after the war, will be used in peacetime. For example, during World War I, we do see that the first X-rays are being used. So we do kind of see experiments, advances in radioactivity, thanks to work from ladies like Marie Curie. Marie Curie was a French scientist. She develops kind of theories of radioactivity that greatly help in X-rays. And those X-rays are used in World War I, but of course we use X-rays outside of war as well. So advances in radioactivity, that's kind of one thing we're seeing in the 1920s. We'll look at Einstein in a second. But we also see advances in psychology as well. Guys like Sigmund Freud, or should I say Sigmund Fraud. Hello, AP psych people. Anyway, Freud is going to kind of develop his theories of psychology, actually thanks to treatment, kind of as a form of treatment to World War I veterans. World War I veterans suffering things like shell shock. Think of that as PTSD, basically. And in order to kind of treat these new mental kind of condition, or not new, I should say, but kind of more widespread and documented mental illnesses, we do see the development of psychology as well. And obviously, we still study psychology today for some reason. But probably the other major scientific discovery that will become very useful in World War II and beyond is going to be Einstein's theories of relativity and his contributions to radioactivity. Basically, how do we harvest atomic energy? And as we will see in World War II, I should say, atomic energy is going to be captured for military reasons. And we'll look at the atomic bombs more later, but Einstein played a role in the scientific theories and literally convincing the United States to build that stuff. All right, so consumer technologies also greatly increased. Consumer technologies, basically, those are things that everyday people buy. The war is going to produce a lot of new ways of manufacturing stuff because the war demanded quick manufacturing to meet wartime needs. This process of new ways of manufacturing, the assembly line, for example, are going to be used in peacetime to produce consumer goods, especially things like the radio and automobiles. Those are kind of the two biggest consumer goods of the 1920s. But we also see that World War I saw innovations in transportation. We saw that airplanes were being used in a military sense. Guess what? They're going to be used in a commercial sense. Guys like Charles Lindbergh, who's depicted down here, are going to conduct transatlantic flights. And this kind of opens up the possibility of commercial airlines, meaning airplanes that transport people over vast distances. That really becomes a thing thanks to improvements to airplane technology that came as a result of World War I. But more widespread access to cars is going to lead to changes in where people live. People increasingly are going to live outside of urban centers in suburbs. So the automobile and its widespread availability after World War I leads to demographic changes. People live in suburbs. But also we see advances in media. And this, in a sense, is going to create a globalized media consumption. And we see this improve media through new technologies like radio. Radio is going to be able to transmit information and culture a lot more quickly over vast distances. Everyone owns a radio. So everyone has the same experience of culture. Popular culture really becomes a thing thanks to developments like the radio. The TV is not a thing yet. That's after World War II. But we also do see advances in film. Film is going to become a thing. Film is widely available, and it is very cheap, actually, to produce and to participate in. So film is going to become a thing. Movies become a thing after World War I. Charlie Chaplin is a good example of a leader, a pioneer in the film industry. He was an English actor that kind of popularizes movies and the film genre. Just as a kind of funny bit right here, this is one of the first science fiction silent films, actually, and it depicts the moon, and that's a spaceship basically going into the moon. All right. So, talk to your neighbor. Talk to your neighbor. Let me be clear. Let me be clear. Talk to your neighbor. I'm Barack Obama. No, I'm not. Okay. So you should be able to identify these things right here. What are some social developments in the 1920s? What's going on in terms of women, in terms of gender? What's going on in consumer culture, in popular media, radio and films? What's going on in art, radio and films? And what's going on in science as well? You should be thinking about these things. All right, that's cool. Let's take a look at the economy. Don't write any of this down if you're writing notes right now. Don't write any of this down. This is just to set up the stage for what's going to happen in just a second, the Great Depression. So what the world look like? What does the world look like in terms of economic situation? Well, places like France and Great Britain and Germany, they're rebuilding from World War I. And guess what? They're taking loans out from the United States. So these places are heavily indebted to the United States in order to pay back anything going on in terms of their rebuilding efforts. Germany, for example, Germany, just trying to kind of emphasize one more thing, is going to be suffering still this hyperinflation. This is a German citizen, and I was not kidding when I said wheelbarrows were literally used to pay for groceries. This is all of the German marks right here. Literally, German money was so worthless, people used it as wallpaper. They burned it for fuel because it was virtually worthless. You needed like a billion things to buy one piece of candy, for example, or one loaf of bread, to use a more kind of nutritious example. So Europe is generally economically dependent on the United States for its rebuilding efforts, especially American banks investing money in the European economies. Hopefully those American banks never collapse. They do. The USSR kind of isolated from the rest of the world. It's kind of doing its own thing. The USSR mostly isolated. partially because Stalinism believes in isolationism, but also because of the fact that Western capitalist countries don't want to do business with Europe, or I should say with the USSR, with Soviet Union. USA, obviously, major economic center of the post-war world because of their vast presence in Europe in the form of loans. That's kind of how we see America becoming a dominant world power. Japan is also developing its own industry. Japan is developing an automobile industry, and we'll talk about Japan later. But also trade. All right, let's look at the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is going to be one of the worst international economic crises of the 20th century, and it's going to have a lot of impacts on political situations around the world. So I would watch that video, actually. It's Heimler's History, Interwar Period. It's a pretty good video. Sums up everything pretty good, in case you don't want to watch this horrible slog fest of me talking to you. You know, it's not a horrible slogfest. I fill it with humor. Well, it's not. It's mostly not funny though. It's very dry humor. It's like the Saharan desert of humor. That's my humor right there. It's very dry. It's like a nice bottle of Merlot. It's very dry. And don't drink until you're 21. Obviously, that's dry. People describe wine that way. Anyway, all right. Great Depression. That's what I go through. That was a bad joke. Okay. I'm fine. How are you doing? You doing fine? I'm talking to you. You specifically. Hope you're doing okay, champ. Anyway, let's talk about the Great Depression. Let's talk about an economic crisis, not a philosophical and personal one. Well, what is going to cause the Great Depression? Well, a few things. For one thing, probably one of the biggest immediate things that will start off the chain of events that will start the Great Depression is the stock market crash in the United States. The United States stock market goes kaboom! It was going up so much in the 1920s. Unregulated stock market, unregulated banking system. But guess what? People are going to suddenly panic and they're going to sell all their shares very rapidly. And that's going to lead to a massive devaluing of the stock market. And that, in and of itself, is not that big of an impact for everyday people. But for banks, it's a bad deal. Because banks had no regulations on where they could put their money. And banks put a lot of money in the stock market. They put depositors' own money in the stock market. And suddenly, after it crashes, banks are broke. They have no money. So banks are going to increasingly shut down around the United States. The Great Depression begins in the US, so blame the United States for the Great Depression. So banks are going to close, and that's a bad problem. That's a major problem in the world. Because American banks provided loans, not just for American businesses, but for entire European countries that suddenly have to pay back those loans. So we do kind of see that banks are going to recall their loans. They're going to charge very high interest rates to try and make sure they have enough money. And virtually, this is going to lead to an economic and global collapse. This is going to be a really big deal. The fact that American banks recall their loans, they make their loans be paid early. And when this happens, that means businesses and factories go bankrupt. Suddenly, all that employment, it goes away. When the banks fail, that means there's no people lending money to factories. Factories don't have enough money to pay for upkeep of a lot of workers. Suddenly, they're out of business. And this is going to lead to massive unemployment. One of the biggest issues of the Great Depression is unemployment. In places like the United States, unemployment reaches 25%. That is absolutely outrageous. 1 out of every 4 possibly employed people that can be employed are unemployed. And even more people are underemployed. They're not making very good wages. It's about half of people making very low underemployed wages. One day you are making a high-paying union job in a factory. But after that, after the stock market crash, after the Great Depression, we do see that there will be high unemployment and underemployment. People who were formerly in factories, now they're selling apples on the street. That's underemployment right there. They're making less money compared to what they used to have. But other things are going to intensify the Great Depression, especially kind of that in the United States, which was a major exporter of food, especially after World War I. Food prices are going to increase thanks to agricultural collapse. There's a thing called the Dust Bowl that happens in the United States. And basically, the United States has no food, or very limited amount of food, I should say. That's going to lead to increased prices of the thing people need the most, but people can't pay for because there's no jobs. And this obviously impacts the United States, but it impacts every place dependent on American agricultural production. But we also see that governments are going to respond to the Great Depression by introducing protectionist trade policies. Basically, they're going to say, if we want to jumpstart our economy, we got to bring back tariffs. We got to bring back high restrictions on trade to improve domestic manufacturing, to make people buy American, to make people buy German, to make people buy British. However, this is going to kind of intensify the crisis in that it will lead to a direct decline of overseas trade. Suddenly, no one wants to do business because they have to pay high tariffs on stuff they're importing. So that is going to actually lead to a decline in overseas trade that hurts exporting raw material countries. In the United States, an example of a really high tariff is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It's the highest tariff in American history. And it's going to basically say, it's basically going to discourage, I should say, other powers from doing business in the US. There is suddenly less trade. That means further economic decline. So let's take a look at the impact of the Great Depression. Well, for one thing, the Great Depression is going to be a very scary time period for a lot of people. Suddenly, there is going to be massive unemployment. This is especially true in industrial countries that suddenly have a lot of factories closed down. Germany, for example, also experiences extremely high unemployment. But we also do see what we call deflation. Deflation is a rapid decline in the price of goods. And that's not a bad thing when you think about it, right? Deflation, things suddenly cost less. Wow, that's awesome. However, that is going to mean that businesses are making less money since there is less in terms of price. So we do kind of see a downward spiral. People are stopping to buy consumer goods because there's unemployment. That leads to falling prices. Suddenly, factories and businesses can't make as much money needed to pay for workers. So suddenly, businesses are going to go out of money or go out of business. And that's going to lead to even more unemployment. That leads to even less demand for goods. That means even less prices. That means there's even less manufacturing production. And we also do see one of the biggest impacts of the Great Depression is a decline of global trade. Suddenly, no one is trading because of the Great Depression. However, what I want to focus on primarily is political impacts of the Great Depression. Well, we are going to see actually that there is going to be a variety of responses to the Great Depression. This is what you should focus on your unit worksheet in the summary section. So we are going to see that generally in places like Germany and Italy and Japan, there is going to be increasing mistrust in traditional liberal governments. Liberal governments, essentially, these are governments that want free speech, that want freedoms of civil liberties, but also capitalism. And suddenly it seems that this idea of complete laissez-faire capitalism is not something to trust. And actually, we do see that not only will there be a mistrust of capitalism, there's going to be a mistrust of democracy itself. Democratic governments let this happen. And that's going to be especially true in places like Germany, Italy, Japan, Brazil, Argentina, Egypt. Because in these places, we are going to see a rise of authoritarian, anti-democratic governments. And these governments are going to emerge saying, democracy failed you. We need to have a strong dictator. But let's look at some general solutions to how societies will try and solve the Great Depression. Well, generally, we are going to see that one of the biggest results of the Great Depression is that there will be increased government involvement in the economy, and that's true around the world. And there are a few ways that governments are going to try and solve the Great Depression. For one thing, they're going to think, if we raise the tariff, that means people will want to buy our manufactured goods, domestic manufactured goods, because they're cheaper than goods from other places. So that's kind of one way governments try to solve the Great Depression, raising tariffs. They also do things like devaluing the currency. Basically, they are going to kind of adjust their economy, their monetary policy, so that their money is worth more, basically, so that people they're going to pull out a lot of money in circulation. They're going to reduce the money supply. They're taking out money from the economy, destroying it, burning it in some cases. And we do kind of see that governments are going to reject kind of more loosey-goosey monetary policies. You don't need to know specifics. That's just raising tariffs. That's more understandable. We do generally see that some societies will get off the gold standard because they want to stay more competitive with the international market. They want their money to reflect kind of the changes in the economy. So we will see some countries get off the gold standard. But probably one of the biggest areas we see government presence in the economy is through regulation of banking institutions, but also through government programs like welfare, giving people money during times of economic decline, giving people jobs during times of economic decline. So that's going to be one, probably the biggest way governments are responding to the Great Depression. So many people are unemployed, give them jobs. I would take a look at this chart right here. This kind of looks at the differences between different social systems. Communism, obviously what the Soviet Union is doing during this time. Capitalism, what we're seeing in Western countries, in liberal countries, so democratic countries like Great Britain, France, the United States. And we'll take a look at fascism more later and what that means. But it's a big result of the Great Depression. All right, so let's take a look at the Great Depression in industrial states. Well, the Great Depression is going to have kind of a different impacts around the world. In industrial states, we are going to see the Great Depression has a lot of impacts in terms of employment. Look on the whiteboard right now. I'm commanding you. Yeah, you. John. None of you are named John, actually. I've never had a John student. That's not true. I've had a Johnny before, but he went by Johnny. He's a good kid. Good kid. What's in it? There's a lot of Wrens this year. Who else? Anyway, I'm not going to call it any names because this will date this video. Or it's already dated. I already mentioned that you have a sub and you might be watching this in 2024. Who knows? Anyway, let's look at how the Great Depression is going to impact democratic societies. And basically kind of read liberal as democratic, small d. So they have a democracy and capitalism. That's what a liberal country is. So the Great Depression is going to impact places around the world, but it's also going to impact liberal countries like Great Britain and France. These places have democracy and they have capitalism. So how do these places respond to the Great Depression? Well, they're going to kind of respond to the Great Depression by ending the gold standard, by getting their money more kind of adjusted based on the global economy. They're going to reduce interest rates from banks. So banks are going to kind of lend money more willingly out to people. That will help out with building up the factories. But we also see that in addition to strong social welfare, in addition to direct government payments and unemployment relief, we do see that these places of Great Britain and France are going to still rely on their colonies for trade. They're going to rely on their colonies as places to buy cheap raw materials and manufacture goods. So let's look at the US of A. You're going to learn about the USA and its response to the Great Depression a lot more next year. I finished talking about it in APUSH. But we do see that the United States is going to adopt policies we call Keynesian economics. And basically, Keynesian economics is one way that countries generally are responding to the Great Depression. But what is that? Well, Keynesian economics is the idea that it's the government's responsibility to ensure consumers have greater ability to participate in the economy. And how do we achieve this ability to participate in the economy? We achieve this through giving out jobs, giving out government jobs, things like public works jobs, infrastructure jobs, literally giving people money through programs like Social Security, to use the United States as an example. And generally, we are going to see the United States is going to have a lot of government welfare programs, a lot of job programs through a legislative program by the President of the United States, a guy by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, is going to issue what is called the New Deal. The New Deal is a bunch of job programs to get unemployed people back to work. It's going to give out money to retired people, I should say, in the form of Social Security. There are other things generally, but the New Deal is a really good example of how governments are responding to the Great Depression. Basically, the United States is giving out jobs, is promoting public infrastructure projects, more jobs, is providing social welfare in the form of bread lines, in the form of literally free food, and in the form of old age pensions, of retired pensions like Social Security. So yes, the New Deal is basically job programs and welfare. But what about in places like Germany and Italy? What's the impact of the Great Depression there? Well, before we look at that, the Soviet Union, the USSR, largely not impacted by the Great Depression, mostly because no one wanted to trade with them. No one loaned them money, for example. So we do see that the United Soviet Socialist Republics is not going to be that impacted. And actually, it's during the Great Depression. This is when we see Stalin initiate the 5-year plan. So if you were absent for that day about Stalinism, I would review what those are because that's important. But generally, that's how the Soviet Union responds. Really, they stay isolationist and continue with the 5-year plans. But in places like Italy, Germany, and Japan, the Great Depression is going to make their citizens kind of say, democracy sucks. Democracy led us into this horrible situation, allowing for a truly free market and giving out a lot of civil liberties. That kind of makes people scared of democracy. And this is actually going to see that we will have a rise of authoritarian leaders, leaders that promise to do something about the Great Depression if you give them absolute power over society. So kind of liberal governments in Japan, Italy, and Germany, these governments are really not going to be able to respond to the Great Depression in a way that effectively solves big issues like unemployment. And when that happens, people are going to blame these governments for not doing enough. Maybe we need more radical leaders in charge. Maybe we should appoint the people. Maybe we should elect the people who are promising to bring back jobs and restore our national honor. So we will see a rise of nationalist authoritarian leaders as a result of the Great Depression. That's why the Nazis come to power in Germany. Germany's Weimar Republic was powerless to stop the Great Depression. So German voters are going to say, we need a change. We need to kind of elect the guys who are saying who's causing all these problems. And we'll talk about that more later. So how are these governments, how are authoritarian governments in places like Italy, Germany, and Japan responding specifically to the Great Depression? Well, for one thing, these governments are going to practice something known as autarky. Autarky is the idea of self-sufficiency, We don't need to trade with no other powers. We are self-sufficient. So there is going to be this idea of self-sufficiency, of isolationism in a way in these countries like Italy, like Germany, like Japan. Basically, they are going to say, we need to remove ourselves from global trade. But how do you become self-sufficient, you say? Well, you need to make sure you have enough natural resources. And how do you get enough natural resources? You invade other places. And that's going to be a big reason why World War II will happen. Countries like Germany and Japan are going to say, in order to become economically self-sufficient, we need to take over new territory with a lot of natural resources, with oil, for example. Wars for oil, that's always a continuity in world history. We'll also see that these governments are going to practice something known as corporatism. Basically, corporatism is kind of a combination of capitalism and socialism in a way. Kind of these governments are going to allow for private companies to still exist. However, the government of these places is going to tell these corporations what to produce and also kind of set standards of what private businesses are supposed to produce at the end of the day. So corporatism is going to allow for monopolies, for example, so not completely a free market. But we do see that there is still capitalism at the end of the day. Private companies still exist, but they're told by the government what to produce. And what they produce, mostly military things. We'll look at that more later, though. We'll talk about corporatism more later when we talk about the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, and to a degree, Japan as well. What about the Great Depression in the under-industrialized world? Who is impacted by that? Well, how does the Great Depression actually impact places like Africa and Asia? Because these places, largely not industrialized, but nonetheless, they are still members of the global economy. So we are going to see that the Great Depression has a big impact in Africa and Asia in a lot of ways. The Great Depression led to a decline of global trade. As a result, export-reliant countries like African societies, like India, are going to suffer as a result of this decline of global trade. We are going to see that the Great Depression is going to be one factor that will motivate a call for industrialization in many places around the world, especially in Latin America. But we also see that much like Germany and Italy and Japan, there will be a rise of more authoritarian leaders, of leaders promising to solve the Great Depression if people give up civil liberties. But we also see the Great Depression is going to intensify anti-colonial movements, and that's especially true in India. And like I said, India is probably the best example of this. India is going to suffer a decline of global trade because there is little demand for manufactured products. These manufactured products, however, relied on raw materials from India. So India is going to suffer as a result of this. And this is going to kind of lead to people saying, well, we're not industrialized at all. We can't use our raw materials. We can't sell our raw materials to anybody because we're so dependent on Britain for all of our manufactured goods. So we do see that India is going to kind of be motivated by the Great Depression for further calls for independence. We'll take a look at that more later. All right, let's look at a place like Latin America. Let's look at Brazil. Well, Brazil is actually going to see the rise of a dictator, of a military dictator by the name of Getulio Vargas. We'll talk about him more later, but he's essentially going to be a fascist. He's going to be an authoritarian leader that is going to implement ideas of corporatism, of autarky. He's going to help industrialize Brazil, but he's a very brutal pro-capitalist leader. That's kind of what a fascist dictator is. Pro-capitalist, brutal leader. So under guys like Vargas, under authoritarian leaders in places like Egypt and Argentina and Brazil, we are going to see that the government is going to centralize political power. And we do see that this government is going to tell corporations what to produce, allow for monopolies, but they do also provide some welfare programs. So Brazil is going to be an example of an authoritarian country as a result of the Great Depression. And that's basically it. All right. So you should be able to identify causes of the Great Depression, especially why it becomes a global crisis. That's because there is a decline of global trade. But also, you should be able to identify the big results of the Great Depression. It will lead to the rise of more authoritarian governments in Germany and Italy and Japan and Brazil and Argentina and Egypt. But it also does lead to generally more government presence in the economy. Governments like the United States, with the New Deal under its president, Franklin Roosevelt, we do see that the United States will have a more active presence in the economy through giving out jobs, through social welfare, and through reforms to prevent banking corruption and the stock market corruption. All right. So I hope you have a bibbity boppity good day. Enjoy your weekend. Cool cats. Peace in the Middle East. Why do I even bother? I don't know. I think it's because I'm tired. I'm hungry. I want to eat dinner. All right. God bless everybody. And stop. And